Section 4. Major dramatic forms. Comedy. This is a term loosely used and generally applied to a wide range of dramatic writings. As a form of drama, comedy is concerned with man's relation to society and deals with experience considered rather suitable than questionable. Comedy as a dramatic form varies in terms of mode, topicality, technique and quality. This has given rise to two broad categories of comedy: high comedy and low comedy. These are further categorized into comedy of manners, comedy of humors, intrigue comedy, etc. High comedy, for example, utilizes mature effect of comedy of character. In other words, it draws its effects from a complex view of character and does not depend on farcical intrigue or any such situation as is common with low comedy. Similarly, comedy of humor is a kind of comedy of character informed by the humorous or such traits as avarice, jealousy, etc. However, there is always the tendency for oversimplification of an otherwise serious issue due to the farcical dimension of this variety of comedy. Comedy of humors reached its perfection in France with Molière. It was, however, the perfect type that was not very popular in England for a long time. The English audience seems to be warm-hearted than the French. They like to empathize with the characters on the stage and laugh with and or at them. Ben Jonson, a notable proponent of the comedy of humors, wielded a great deal of influence on the English audience. Thereafter, to enjoy a Johnsonian comedy of humors, the audience must detach themselves from empathizing with the actors in the play. For example, sorrow for a man who is jealous is made to be less funny. If at all, the English audience preferred a character like Falstaff, who enjoys his own absurdities and laughs along with the audience. Comedy of manner is also linked with characters. This is because the terms manners suggest ethics and moral actions, and since they are expressed through the comedy of manners, it is more or less the same as comedy of character. It is a comedy that wittily presents fashionable life. The comic element in this case derives not so much from the characters as it does from the way the playwright expresses the peculiar traits. The playwright, in other words, laughs at humanity and urges his audience to do the same. Classical Greek comedy. Comedy had served and still serves a definite function like tragedy. It is also remotely connected with the religious rites of fertility and reproduction. Aristotle berated comedy as lower in quality of topicality and technical details. He defined comedy as an artistic imitation of men of an inferior moral bent, and writers of comedy were lampooners who did not rise above their fancy. Faulty not in every way, however, but to the degree that their shortcomings are ludicrous, for the ludicrous is a species or part, not all of the ugly. He argued further that the ludicrous might be described as a kind of shortcoming and deformity that does not strike us as painful and does not cause harm to others. Aristophanes' advent and contribution to classical Greek comedy marked a significant turning point in the development of the form in general. Aristophanes imposed a more direct sociological function on comedy. With him, comedy became an instrument of attack on social and political misdemeanor. It became an inventive against Athenian leaders and institutions that constituted themselves into agents of oppression and corruption. Aristophanes 448 C to 385 BC. Even though there were writers of comedy during his period, Aristophanes remained the greatest of them all. He was fortunate to have had most of his plays preserved. The quality of these plays showed that he was a man of unusual brilliance and wit. He was constantly crusading for a return to the good old days and always opposing any new idea. This is why most critics describe him as being conservative. He exercised the freedom of speech almost to a fault. He is one playwright who could sometimes be at his best and other times at his worst. Most of his plays, including The Frogs, The Birds, and The Clouds, draw their titles from the choruses respectively. The role of the choruses has provided much mixture of ribaldry, satire, and poetry. The Frogs. This is perhaps the best known among his plays. This is probably so because The Frogs provides an effective avenue for Aristophanes to make his position known on what he considers as artistic beauty. The Frogs allows Aristophanes bound ground to pontificate, even if indirectly. The play is premised on the historical fact that Sophocles and Euripides had died in the same year, about 405 BC, and as a result, Athens was sturdily thrown into literary darkness. Athens had no major tragic poet. This historical event readily provided Aristophanes with the raw material for The Frogs. The play opens with Dionysus expressing concern about the absence of any major tragic poet and his decision to visit Hades to demand the return of Euripides. Dionysus and his servant Sancias set out on the epic journey, the former disguising as the legendary Achilles, who was said to have successfully visited Hades before them. Dionysus, like Achilles, wears a lion's skin and carried a club. The two characters later arrive at the door of Eacus, judge of the dead. Unknown to Dionysus, Achilles in the previous journey has strangled the judge watchdog. Thus, when he introduced himself as Achilles, the reaction of Eacus is a hostile, aggressive tongue-lashing. Achilles is so overwhelmed by fear that he literally falls to the ground. Back to his senses, Dionysus strongly concludes that it may no longer be safe to appear as Achilles, so he decided to switch roles with his servant Sacians. He put on his servant's dress, while the servant put on Achilles' dress. The door opens again, but this time a beautiful maid of Persephone appears to welcome Sacians now. Achilles. But before Sacians could join the waiting dancing girls, Dionysus again forces himself to switch roles just in time to face a raging landlady. They are arrested by Achilles' guard. In order to escape torture, Dionysus insists that he is a god and not the captor, decides to torture both Sacians and Dionysus. It is believed that if he were a god, then Dionysus would not feel any pain. Dionysus feels the pain that leads to a rather hilarious endurance contest. Shortly after, both Sacians and Dionysus arrive at the realm of Pluto, where they find Euripides. Achelous and Sophocles, a trial is set in motion to decide who should return to Athens among the three great tragic poets. Sophocles voluntarily withdraws, leaving Euripides and Achelous in the contest. Finally, the greater is determined by literally weighing the verse of each of them. Achelous wins the contest. An imaginary contest between the two playwrights, Achelous and Euripides, for the purpose of a critical evaluation of their plays, provide the organizing motive. The contest in The Frogs does not, however, give full or exhaustive estimates of the two contestants. Similarly, Aristophanes' judgment cannot be drawn into a clearly divine critical mode. However, certain points are noteworthy. This includes his view, which are always grounded in good sense, the consistency with which he expresses discontentment with excesses and affections of any kind, the presentation of his ideas and views on the poet in more concrete terms than those of his contemporaries. He achieved this by setting the two poets before the audience in order to reveal themselves through his method of selective quotations, autoria, comments, or the quotations, and intelligibly parody. All these are informed by the close attention Aristophanes pays to the text, and which in some sense foreshadows modern textual analysis by critics. The mode of context is more or less a straightforward one. Archelaus and Euripides in the literal pair of scales alternately weight lines from each other's play. At the end of the competition, Archelaus emerged as the poet with weightier lines. He has to give ground on a few artistic points. In the final rounds, the rightness of logic of the political advice offered by each poet is also determined. In the course of the disputes, a number of weaknesses and idiosyncrasies of the two poets are revealed. This approach affords the audience a fair assessment of the two poets' good qualities. For example, the authorial admiration of Euripides even while ridiculing him. This is an admiration that is quite different from familiarity. It enables him to select the more telling lines of phrases to use on Euripides, an admiration that informs his gentleman language on Euripides. He is good-natured and never abusive in his handling of the poet. It is an admiration that does not call to question Euripides' reputation or personal qualities, and that accords him artistic merit. Euripides' artistic merits include the fact that he clarifies tragedy through his skillful use of prologues that explain details and give a clear picture of subsequent events. In addition, Euripides has a flair for dialogue, an important element of drama, as opposed to the set speech method of Archelaus. Similarly, Euripides' realism and or rationalism tend to bring tragedy closer to real life than was possible for his contemporaries and poets before him. It is observed also that in the art and craft of tragedy, Aristotle had rated Euripides slightly higher than Archelaus. Archelaus' victory, we must point out, is more on moral ground, dignity and virtue, than on any other consideration. Euripides, on the other hand, has a realistic, colloquial, and a rather undignified style. He is also accused of immorality and sophistry. When he reminds Dionysus that a god has sworn to take him back to the world of the living, Dionysus then responds with the faithful words from Euripides' own play, Hippothoos, only my tongue has sworn. It is apparent that Aristophanes has not been quite objective when balancing Archelaus and Euripides, and by no means does it leave Archelaus unscathed. Part of Archelaus' shortcoming is his high-flown phrases, arrogant and straining compounds, against which Euripides protests. Let us at least use the language of men. Similar protests have since been replicated by generations of critics like Chiwenzo et al. In their reaction to the writings of poets like Christopher Okigbo and Wole Soyinka. It is in the light of this that Archelaus' frequent use of undramatic sentences or inaccessible language is attacked. However, Archelaus' shortcoming notwithstanding, the bias in his favor is not easily discernible because he is presented with dignity and pose, whereas Euripides is dismissed with quick ease and almost impudently. Again, it should be recalled that Euripides triggers half the issue of moral in the first instance with his response to the question on the grounds a poet should be admired. What gift do you hold that a poet should have to be worthy of men's admiration? To which Euripides respond, if his act is true and his counsel sound, and if he brings out to the nation by making men better in some respect. In other words, it requires a superlative craftsmanship and the skill of a talented teacher capable of making men better through his wise counsel. Aristophanes no doubt knows the primary duty of the poet, even in the present circumstance, which is to entertain. This is also supported by Aristotle and now by Euripides, whose plays are informed by patriotic zeal. Even then, Aristophanes knows that beyond the socio-political crisis, Athens had need of dignity and a sense of honor, for which Achilles has stood his place again and maintained in the critical fireworks as represented in the frogs. Achilles, for instance, strongly believes that even when ugly things are there in nature, a poet has no business depicting them, contrary to what we have in Phaedra. Euripides: and Phaedra, do you think a story is false, imagined by me a mere fiction? Achilles: unhappily no, she is real, but a poet should seek to avoid the depiction of evil, should hide it, not drag into view its ugly and odious features. For children have tutors guide them aright, young manhood has poets for teachers. In other words, we must write of the fair and the good. Even the use of the language of the common man is frowned at. This brings us to the great judgment. The decision is obviously predictable. At first, Dionysus' assignment is almost completed, as he must choose between the lyre and the tambourine girl. One I think clever, the other delights me. Whichever is likely to advise the city well, him I intend to take back. But later he declares, him I choose in whom my soul delights. Italian Renaissance comedy. From the 14th century, new concepts of drama spread through Europe until 1650 AD, after which they dominated the European theatre till as late as the 19th century. After 1450 AD, the revival of interest in classical learning accelerated. The Roman became the focus of universal study. Seneca's tragedies were regarded as illustrations of moral lessons and of rhetoric. The comedies of Plautus and Terence, which were valued as models of oral styles and productions based on these influences, were presented at the courts and academics. They were performed by court poets, court architects, and painters, and acted by courtiers to the music of court musicians. They were simply called commedia erudita, but the productions were largely amateurish. However, there were other plays performed by professional troupes whose works could be traced to Italian farce of Rome, traceable to and preserved since the Middle Ages. These were the comedies of the professional players that were later referred to as the commedia dell'arte. It marked the beginning of opera as well as revival of pastoral drama. The opera, for example, came into being unintended and by sheer coincidence through misinterpretation of Greek tragedies by Peri and Runusinin, two enthusiastic scholars who had erroneously thought that Greek tragedies has been sung. Their premier production of Daphne had marked the world's first ever opera. It was a dramatic form not bound by any classic restrictions. This exercised liberty, as well as its characteristics, scenic embellishment, further led to its popularity and rapid growth. Even though the pastoral drama in the 16th century Italy was of low quality, it is worth our attention, particularly because of the contribution of Torquato Tasso, 1544 to 1595, whose play, though idyllic and rather sentimental, possesses an air of sincerity and nostalgic beauty which had created wide appeal and wielded much influence. The best example of comedies of the time was Niccolo Machiavelli, La Mandragola de Madrid in 1250. The general characteristics of the form of comedy prevalent at the time had included the following: improvisation. Actors worked from a plot of outline made of both dialogue and action. Each actor played the same character throughout his career, so there was much repetition of lines, etc. Lags were bits of standardized comic business indicated in the plot line. Furthermore, actors who played the straight characters, for example, the young lovers, usually took notebooks in which they recorded and memorized sentiments lifted from poetry and some other popular literary works. Spontaneity. Acting was fresh and rather spontaneous, requiring great concentration since no one could predict what the other actors could do or say next. Characters were largely stock types. Characterization. It is instructive to note that the straight roles were those of young lovers, called innamorato male, innamorata female, or amoroso M and amoraza F. They were witty, beautiful, fashionable, and without mask. Each company professional had one or two pairs. The stock plot follows the pattern whereby an elderly father usually opposes the young man in love. At the same time, the young lady is sophisticated and a courtly damsel. Furthermore, character roles are divided into masters and servants. There are three types of masters: the captain, a braggart, and a coward. He boasts of his prowess in love and battle, only to be discredited on the long run. The second master is a merchant, elderly, and usually the father of one of the lovers. Although he is also courting a young woman, he has a large hooked nose and is bearded. The third master, the doctor, is usually an established doctor of law in the society, usually pompous through the use of bombast and Latin. He tries to show off his false learning. He is always wearing an academic gown. He is often tricked and cheated. He is a tyrant of a father, a jealous husband. The servants are called zani, usually two of them, one clever, the other stupid. There is also a maid, Fatencia Colombi, who attends to the innamorata. Maids are young, vulgar, and witty. Sometimes they are wives to servants or mistresses of old men. The most popular of the zani was Arechin, a very cunning dancer and acrobat, always at the center of any intrigue in the plot. His clothes showed irregular, lousy patches, suggestive of abject poverty. He carried a wooded sword called slapstick. Another servant called Bingela, or the Scorpion, was a cruel, witty, and cynical person. Often they are interchangeably, that is, the captain or Bingela. Finally, there was Pinchinello. He could be a servant or the host of an inn, or a merchant. He was alternately stupid and shrewd, wicked and loving, dull and witty. It was also the origin of the English puppets of the Punch and Judy shows. He had an enormous long nose, a hunchback, a straight pointed chin, and wore a long pointed hat. English Renaissance. Drawings, Origin of Species, as well as Niccolo Machiavelli, true politic method of enslavement and expropriation, and The Prince, had an overwhelming influence on the national psyche, modes, and mood of the European nations. and the Renaissance English society in particular, to the degree that imperialism, individualism, and obsession with crude power and or material acquisition offered a new meaning to life itself. Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, among others, were preoccupied in their works with topicalities that addressed these worrisome psychosocial developments. Elizabethan comedy. William Shakespeare. Again, for the sake of brevity, our reference shall be limited to the works of two great comic playwrights of the period, William Shakespeare 1564 to 1616 and Ben Jonson 1572 to 1637. What immediately strikes one about these two great playwrights is the irony that has become a role player in their respective lives. Many, including this writer, consider Shakespeare as the greatest writer who ever lived, even though he had no knowledge degree, unlike many of his contemporaries. Often he was described as a country boy with no knowledge education, but ironically he had outdistanced his contemporaries in literary value that has endured to date. His contribution to Elizabethan comedy has remained almost unequaled. Shakespeare's comedies are a lot different from those of his contemporaries. He, no doubt, drew his inspiration from within and outside his immediate society. These sources and materials were made to undergo a severe transformation through the meal of his unusual creative sensibility, which that they are completely different and unique, whether as tragedy or comedy or as poetry. Shakespearean comedies are often categorized as humorous comedy, often having a pastoral and romantic setting. Similarly, the plots are almost unrealistic, and one might wonder if some of them are realizable on a modern stage. However, this does not mean that Shakespeare was out of touch with reality. Therefore, we still find in his comedic cosmos inferior characters like servants, as well as superior or noble characters, that is, highly placed men, dukes, princes, heroes, and heroines. The subject of Lord that engage his social vision in some of his tragedies is, again, the main and dominating emotion in most Shakespearean comedies. The hero is a lover, and the status of action is determined by the cause of love, which does not run without complications when it is genuine. The comedies illustrate this. The plot is manipulated in such a way that both fancy and intrigues are balanced in equal proportions. Therefore, through some complexities, the ending proves pleasurable and satisfactory. Another exciting feature that makes Shakespearean comedy unique is his choice of appropriate organizing motifs. Shipwreck, exile, or some such catastrophe. Closely linked with this primary motive is the issue of disguise and or mistaken identity. The heroine assumes a boy's garment, for example, Rosalind, Portia, Viola, performed by Elizabethan boy actors. The significance of the mistaken identity development of the plot is not so much the suspense as the confusion engendered by it. There are also plenty music of exquisite lyric written by Shakespeare scattered all over the place. Furthermore, there are comic characters, including clowns of different types. They include Lancelot, Gobbo, and his father, Festigacus, Sir Andrew Aguecheek, and Sir Peter Belch Malvolio. On a more general note, there is abundant goodwill and cheer. There is, in other words, a sense of universal well-being, and besides Malvolio, who is an exception, there is a general absence of darker forces. It is almost unbelievable that Shakespeare's dramatic shift in his writing career from tragedy to comedy did not in any way affect his sense of the comedic, except perhaps it can be argued that his tragic comedies are indeed tragedy in transition. Perhaps not. This, among other reasons, has informed our choice of The Tempest, a tragic comedy for analytical purposes in the present study. The Tempest. Shakespeare's source for the subject of The Tempest are the narratives of the wreck of Sir George Somers, Sir Thomas Gates, William Strachey, Sylvester Jordan, Richard Rich, and a few others on the Bermudas in July 1609. The plot is built around Prospero, Duke of Milan, who, due to an unusual negligence on his part, being more interested in books and magic than in the effective running of his dukedom, is expelled by his brother Antonio. He is put to sea on a rotting ship with his little daughter, Miranda. They reach an island inhabited by a semi-human creature, Caliban, son of Psychora, the witch who had imprisoned Aria, a spirit. But Prospero, through his superior magic, makes the two his servants. 12 years later, the point where the play actually begins, Prospero through his magic causes a shipwreck of King Alonso of Naples and his followers, including his brother Sebastian, his son Ferdinand, the honest councillor Gonzalo, and Prospero's own brother Antonio Ferdinand. In the course of the shipwreck, is separated from the others. This gives him the erroneous impression that he is the only survivor. He meets Miranda and at once falls in love through the design of Prospero's magical power. Even though Prospero feigns ignorance and accuses Ferdinand of being a spy and forces him into slave labor. Meanwhile, Sebastian and Antonio attempt to murder Alonso and Gonzalo, and Caliban, who had met Stefano and Truculo, a drunken butler and a jester, persuade them to murder Prospero. Ferdinand is released from his spell by Prospero, gives Miranda to him, and makes Aria present a masquerade before the lovers. Prospero interrupts the entertainment in order to drive off Caliban, Stefano and Truculo, as well as being the sperm-bound King Alonso and his courtiers into his cell. Prospero forgives his brother Antonio, but makes him promise to restore his dukedom, and himself restores Ferdinand to King Alonso. The ship crew is found to be safe. Prospero renounces his magic, frees Aria, and all prepare to set sail for Italy, leaving Caliban once more as the sole occupant of the island. This is one of the plays where Shakespeare adheres to the classical unities of time, place, and action. The acting time takes less than one full day and at one single location. In addition, there is singularity of action. In terms of form and structure, The Tempest is a romance. It belongs to the category of Shakespeare's last play. A feature of plays in this category is that they are largely improbable and they are tragic comedies. The play, as earlier pointed out, is informed by the historical experience of the Age of Exploration. It was a period when many stories went round the strangeness of discovered strange places like the Bermudas Triangle. It is an advanced allegory bordering on a powerful satire. It is also a masquerade crafted in an Elizabethan style and form. The play pursues a similar theme as Mayor for Mayor, another Shakespeare's play about power and authority. Among other things, there is a stopple warning that power is transient. Therefore, the holder of power, if he is negligent or abuses it, is bound to end up in catastrophe. This warning is given eloquence in Prospero, a duke, a man of power and authority, but who prefers to pursue personal interests at the expense of state welfare. He delegates his power to his deputies. However, delegating power should not be misconstrued to mean relegation of one's responsibility, which is the case here, leading to usurpation of power. The circumstances of power in the play involves a call for internal vigilance and close monitoring of accredited agents of delegated powers. Betrayal of trust is a theme central to the play. Likely, not only does Antonio betray the trust of Prospero, Prospero as Ives Duke betrays his people by failing to live up to expectation in the discharging of his duty faithfully. Shakespeare obviously is in sympathy with the authority or the status quo. This reflects in Prospero drifting off and losing his dukedom, and later restored. Prospero Maru experience serves as a purgatorial process, after which he becomes a wiser man who is likely to behave more responsibly and responsibly as a restored duke. The Tempest is an allegory of the Western man who subdues his environment in particular and in nature in general. Through sophisticated technology, Prospero, by the time he quits the throne forcefully, is subjected to disgrace. Is later seen to have improved. He subdued his environment. He is a scholar, a magician, and a shrewd ruler of the island, etc. Prospero, like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, is admirably and self-reliant. But then, Prospero is not a total admirable man, considering his relationship with Caliban. Prospero regards Caliban as an evil that must be contained or eliminated. This is to suggest the evil of modern civilization in realization to the colonization of Africa and the Americas. The question then is, who is the true owner of the island, Prospero or Caliban? Prospero releases Caliban and uses him to carry out his wishes. He completely subdues Caliban and treats him as he would a slave. This is racism. The racist whites seem to draw their conclusion in their justification of Prospero enslavement of Caliban on the fact that Caliban is half beast, half human. But this is not the same feeling of the racist whites in the former apartheid South African about the black or European slavers and later colonial masters of the African continent. The Tempest, to other critics, is a powerful satire on the invasion of colonial powers on people of other races. The allegorical dimension of the play is apparent in the moral end or futility of colonization. For example, Prospero, the colonizer, finally leaves the island, while Caliban, the original owner, stays on. In other words, however long colonialism or apartheid lasts, it is bound to fail, and the original inhabitants shall continue to inherit their nature-giver land. Furthermore, like every colonized state all over the world, the island gains nothing in the end. Prospero, like all colonial powers, only does those things that are directly useful to him. Caliban is reduced to a slave. He is not given the right to education. He is made to lose confidence in himself and in his race. Ariel is left to wander away, etc. Similarly, the aftermath of colonialism is the complete disorientation of a sense of judgment and the gross dislocation of the cultural values of the colonized. The sea storm is a predominant symbol that involves its own peculiar imagery in the play. It suggests that man, by virtue of his existence, is in the storm of life, the storm that sent Prospero away to an island, and the storm that brings both Ferdinand and Miranda together. The duo symbolizes love on one hand, and on the other hand, the former stands for religion and the latter intellectualism. In other words, love, godliness, and knowledge can bring an enduring solution to the storm problems in man's life. Mask elements abound in the play. Music, a lot of it. Dancing, courtiers, and spirits, all in multicolored costumes. In addition, the thrust of the dramatic action and sustained use of contrastive situations and parallelism have helped to determine the dramatic interest. For example, such contrasts include Prospero the Duke versus Prospero the Intellectual, the magician, Prospero the Helpless, and the dethroned duke versus Prospero the selfish and ruthless ruler of the island, Antonio the usurper versus Antonio the captive, Antonio versus Prospero, Prospero versus Caliban. Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson is outstanding among those comic playwrights who succeed William Shakespeare. Unlike Shakespeare, he was a university wit. He was a daring Elizabethan, a social critic who fought both with the pen as well as with the sword. As an English volunteer, his tragedies, which he highly regarded, did not score much success with the public, particularly the Elizabethan audience. This was partly because of the unnaturalness of the plays, which reveal Jonson's conscious attempts to write in the correct classic style. The scholastic technicalities had made his tragedy plays rather inaccessible to the Elizabethan audience. The tragedy generally considered to do the best he ever wrote is Sejanus. Jonson, however, scored tremendous success in comedy. He stands out as Shakespeare's only contemporary rival. As a matter of fact, he is apparently superior to Shakespeare as a comedic satirist. As an academic, there is always an informing theory for any of his efforts at playwriting. This is why he is a significant bust-up in the history of dramatic criticism. One of such theories associated with him is that of the comedy of humors, a concept foregrounded in medieval physiology, and which also informed largely his comedies. They include every man in his humor and every man out of his humor. However, in times of vigor, topicality, and plot technicalities, they cannot compare with what is now known as his four masterpieces: Volpone, The Alchemist, Epicone, and Bartolome Fair. Of the four, Epicone is perhaps funniest, while Volpone, or the Force, is the best of them all. It is the light of this assessment that we shall briefly comment on Volpone. Even though The Alchemist decisively deals with fundamental issues that we can easily identify with, Volpone was not written to simply amuse or entertain, but rather it is a direct attack on the viciousness of the human race. It is concerned more with a strange kind of greed and individualism. It is no wonder, therefore, that it is less accommodating and much bitterer. It is interesting to note also that since Shakespeare and Jonson were contemporaries, it is an irony that the informing social circumstances that have moved the former into writing his great tragedies had predictably moved the latter into writing Volpone among others. In a rather subjective manner, Jonson attempts to direct the thinking of his audience, though boastfully. This he does in the prologue, which contains a great deal of self-advertisement and self-confidence, to a great extent justifiable. Jonson boasts of writing the play in less than 5 weeks, but that it will take 5 generations for anyone to mend it. He lays claim to originality and to universal qualities such as didacticism, the classical unities of time, place and action, and the organic plot structure. On a mere general note, it is indeed less accommodating than The Alchemist. For example, in The Alchemist, the main tricksters are mere ordinary people. The society is no doubt infested with greed, and the common people are making a great deal out of it. We are faced with, according to Bamidele 2000, a real world of experience in which avarice leads man to be craving for quick riches. All the characters in the play run after money and material wealth in a fashion that shows the mockery of human futility. Page 82. In Volpone, however, the main character is of the middle class. Our first encounter with Volpone quite naturally shocked us as he's literally worshipping his wealth. The implication of this is that we feel that the society is unwittingly provoking the wrath of God. The position of God is seriously threatened. He is now being displaced by the advent of wealth, the new God. Generally, Volpone does not provoke an atmosphere of merry tricks, but we certainly are confronted with the reality of God's wrath informed by the monster god, money. It is a wide-ranging satire or criticism of the society embracing every class of people. Volpone fools the people, and rather than they have his wealth, he outwits them. No doubt, the whole thing turns sour for him in the end. The play, like The Tempest by Shakespeare, is more of a tragic comedy. Even though the evil in the society, as represented by the main characters, is finally destroyed, a lot of things has been made to suffer decay. End of study section 4. Thanks for listening.